Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another of our Spring Wonder lectures. And as you know, these lectures are on varying topics as we go through the semester. And today we're welcoming our good friend Richard MacMaster, our absolute favorite historian, and he's going to be speaking to us today on, as you can see, sort of the passing of slavery and the difficult path that took. And, you know, it sort of reminds me of some of the social changes that we're dealing with right now in our country, you know, with the abortion and the Black Lives Matter, and they seem so high in mind. They touch our lives every day. When you go on NPR or any other media, and then when we look back to the early 1800s, there was another burning issue, and that was slavery. And Richard's going to now bring that to life. It looks like it's something that happens sort of gradually over time, but it was a big issue in everybody's lives. Richard, please.
Yeah. Excuse me. I should have done that coughing before we started. So you may have noticed in the news. What? Oh, okay. I was going to say, you may have noticed in the news a while back, a couple of weeks ago, that Laura Trevelyan, who was the BBC correspondent from Washington, had donated £100,000, roughly $130,000, to the people of Grenada, or Grenada, I forget which way it's pronounced, because she said the Trevelyan family owed all of their wealth, their social position, to the labor of the ancestors of people who lived today in that West Indian Isle, and that she felt reparations are due and that they should be taken up by governments and not just by individuals who had a claim because of their ancestors' dependence on slave labor. So we're going to be looking at the slow and gradual dawning of basically that same idea that slavery was something that, yes, I could, if I felt the obligation, and it did happen not infrequently, that individuals convinced that slavery was wrong manumitted their slaves. They set them free at great financial loss. Those people were not very numerous, but as we'll see, they were growing, and with them was growing a climate that would want, finally, the complete abolition of slavery. But again, there's a catch. And some of you may have heard me talk about the Mansfield decision before. This was a decision in the courts. And remember, of course, that Britain doesn't have a written constitution to amend. Everything is done by the precedent of the law courts. That he determined that slavery needed a local law to define it, or it couldn't exist. So there could be no slavery in England. This, however, did not free any slaves. There was no widespread release of people from slavery. Rather, it could be narrowly understood to mean, which was the case at hand, that someone claimed as a slave could not be sent back to a plantation in South Carolina or Barbados, that they were, in fact, free people. But this would happen one by one, and the decision, of course, did not extend to any of the colonies. Calls for abolishing slavery in the American colonies were few. And one of the very few early arguments against slavery, and he was a kind of Quaker preacher, John Woolman, whose wonderful writings, not just on slavery, but he published a book on slavery in the 1750s, urging Quakers to free their slaves. Quakers, like everybody else, had lots of slaves depending on what colony they lived in. And he was arguing that, and had powerful statements like, how could you endure to live by the labor of a slave? As though it would be a physical pain that you could barely stand. And there's a famous story about Woolman where he was visiting a Quaker family in North Carolina, and they clearly were slave owners, and the slaves had prepared his dinner and made his bed, so he told his host that he was going to go and sleep in the field because he did not want to feel that someone had been forced to feed him or forced to make a bed for him, as naturally that was the idea of slavery. And Woolman, who is remarkably influential within the Quaker group, gradually convinced many people, friends on both sides of the Atlantic, that slavery was indeed a wrong and needed to be abolished. Now, the irony of Americans claiming liberty from England while holding others was not lost. And I apologize for the portrait. This is Nathaniel Appleton, as I asked Julianne to put up on this, and I thank her very much for her putting this whole thing together. But I had picked out the wrong portrait of Nathaniel Appleton. The Nathaniel Appleton who published Considerations on Slavery in 1767 was a minister of the Congregational Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this is his grandson, Nathaniel Appleton. As you can see, it's an early 19th century gentleman. Presumably there's some family resemblance. And I am going to read, so I generally don't read anything, but I wanted to get some of the words that Appleton put in here. He wrote and published this in 1767. So it's really quite an early statement. And it came right after the successful campaign to have the Stamp Act repealed, as it was in 1766. And just two quotes from this Considerations on Slavery. O ye sons of liberty, is your conduct consistent? Can you review our late struggle for liberty and think of the slave trade at the same time and not blush? And the successful fight against the Stamp Act will be forever memorable for the glorious stand which America has made for liberty. But if America freed all her slaves, it would show all the world that we are true sons of liberty. So that irony was not lost by some individuals, but it took until the 1770s for the Quakers to begin to seriously emancipate their own slaves. And some wealthy Quaker families said that setting free 100 individuals, many of whom are worth much more than 50 pounds, is a price I simply couldn't pay. I couldn't ruin my family, so they left the Quaker meeting. But the Friends, in their manner, it was to reason with people. So again, it was a slow process, but by the 1770s, they had made this a stand for membership, and they were freeing their slaves. The same thing was also true with some of the evangelical Anglicans, the Methodists. Harry Dorsey Gow in Maryland freed 168 slaves, which is an enormous price that he paid, but he felt that was necessary. And one of the Carters in Virginia freed his slaves. But these were, again, somewhat isolated. And as I say here, by the 1770s, the Quakers had completely lost their political power in Pennsylvania. In 1780, the Pennsylvania Assembly adopted a law abolishing slavery. It was written by George Bryan. George Bryan was a merchant and a lawyer, both, in Philadelphia. He was an Irish Presbyterian born in Dublin, and he had been convinced that Pennsylvania should end slavery. All right. He was surprised to find that the strongest opposition came from fellow Presbyterians, and that it was only with difficulty that they got the law passed in 1780. But the law did not free a single slave. It was the first of many gradual emancipation bills. In Bryan's original text, it applied only to children born of slave parents after January 1st, 1781, the following year. And he wanted them to continue to serve their owner for 18 years. But under pressure from, again, some of his fellow Presbyterians in Chester County, they added another 10 years, so that the only people who would be free would be people who were born after 1781, and they would not be free until 1809. And if you were a slave in 1780 or 1790 or 1800, you would be a slave until your death. This is paralleled by acts in the later 1780s in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, where no one is set free. Of course, there weren't a great many slaves in any of those states, but no one was set free. It applied only to your unborn children, and your unborn children would be free when they had served, usually in those cases, 21 years. But that's a long time to work out the price of emancipation, the price of your emancipation. So in Rhode Island, to get, which incidentally is much more than any of the other New England states, was a slaveholding state and also a center of the slave trade. So in order to get the bill through, they had a provision that the former owner would not be responsible for raising or paying the needs of these children, even though they were working for him. They were going to pass that over to the town and to the taxpayers. And that was the way Rhode Island got that through. So, yeah. So you could grow old as a slave in Pennsylvania, even though Pennsylvania had set all the allegedly freed the slaves in 1780. Other states adopted gradual emancipation or rejected calls altogether. Here you can see the text. This is, yeah. I think this is Rhode Island. Right. Meanwhile, the slave trade flourished on both sides of the Atlantic and was a tremendous business in which all sorts of people were invested. Article 1, Section 9 of our own Constitution guaranteed no interference with the slave trade before 1808. In other words, it had 20 years to flourish. There was opposition to the slave trade in the United States at that time, but it came from two different sources. The constitutional provision was done at the behest of South Carolina and Georgia, which were still being settled, and where they wanted a supply of inexpensive slaves. The idea of abolishing the slave trade was much more popular in the Chesapeake, where they had an oversupply of slaves, but also where they did not want the competition of a flooded market that would reduce the value of the slaves they hold. And so the Constitutional Convention compromised. At that same time, William Wilberforce introduced a bill in the British Parliament. William Wilberforce was a member from a rotten borough of Hull in New Yorkshire. His family had the right to present a candidate for Parliament, and the handful of people who voted would, out of respect for the family, elect them. He was an evangelical Anglican, and one of the things that he did, which would perhaps make him less popular in some circles, was that there was a promulgation by Parliament at the beginning of each Parliament about the morals of the country and calling on the local authorities to enforce a whole list of moral causes. And one of the first things Wilberforce did was he wanted to put teeth in that. And he did. So that it wasn't just a case of saying, we deplore the fact that some people in Britain are adulterers. He wanted them to say, yes, and we're going to put a penalty on what you're doing and hope to root it out. Well, the first time he introduced a bill to abolish slavery, not slavery, but the slave trade, it had one vote, his own. That was in 1786. He continued that fight, and the last letter that John Wesley wrote when he was dying in 1791 was to Wilberforce, telling him to keep up the fight. And every year, Wilberforce offered a bill, and every year the number of votes increased and increased, even though there was a great deal of opposition. And finally, in 1807, he had been 21 years at it, Britain finally abolished the slave trade. And part of that was due to very good public relations, because many people had been drawn to this. That's Josiah Wedgwood over there on the left, the man who had the potteries. And one of the things that Wedgwood made and publicized was that image in the center, which had around it usually the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And this isn't actually one of them, but he made teapots that had a plea for abolish the slave trade and slavery on them. He also made a Wesley teapot with Wesley's grace on it. And I think it's still true that that was usually the gift of a congregation to a departing or retiring Methodist minister in this country. So the slave trade was outlawed in 1807 and in the United States in 1808. And this was a growing popular movement that people on both sides of the Atlantic had grown closer to this. But slavery continues in the United States, and the domestic slave trade continued unabated. you could buy a slave in the District of Columbia, very close to the capital, and take that slave to Alabama or go wherever you wanted. The move toward emancipation had come to a halt in the United States by about 1790. One of the last efforts was in Virginia in 1785, when the Methodists were petitioning for the immediate abolition of all slaves, and the members of the House of Burgesses voted not to lay this petition on the table, but to throw it under the table with as a mark of contempt. And the southern states were not the only ones. The state of New Jersey refused to pass or even consider a bill to abolish slavery until 1846. So you could be a slave owner in Newark, New Jersey at the same time that Florida and Texas were joining the Union. And in the British West Indies, slavery continued. Slaves working on a sugar plantation. Now, this is 1829, and this is, my goodness, I can't think of her name. And it's not on the book. This lady was a school teacher in an academy for young ladies in Leicester, England. And she was a convinced anti-slavery person. And she wrote a little book called Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition, or an inquiry into the shortest, safest, and most effective means of getting rid of West Indian slavery. And the argument was, if you think slavery is a moral evil, shouldn't we abolish it immediately, whatever the cost? And this little pamphlet gained a great deal of circulation on both sides of the Atlantic and convinced many people that we could not wait any longer. I wish I could remember her name. That's one of these things. You've got somebody who's 88 and you can't remember everything. I often don't remember the things I did 10 minutes ago. So anyway. In 1831, one of the groups that were, or one of the things that happened frequently was there was a convention of colored people. Free Black leaders got together and talked about issues that affected their communities, usually in the North. In 1831, they met at Mother Bethel Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And three significant people came to join them, people who were, in fact, colonizationists. Part of the American response to gradual emancipation was also colonization. wouldn't it be wonderful if once free, all of these people could just get on a boat and go back to Africa? And they created Liberia and a separate Maryland in Liberia beginning in 1819. And that was supposed to siphon off all the free African-American people. So we didn't have to worry about their voting or their having equal rights in any other way. Well, you may remember Professor Wyatt Brown in the history department at the University of Florida. He died a few years ago. And long before we came to Gainesville, he had published Lewis Tappan and the Evangelical War Against Slavery. And that's a picture of Lewis Tappan, who was a philanthropist who funded all kinds of evangelical causes in the city of New York. And I read that book when it was first published, and it made a tremendous impression on me, as I told Wyatt Brown when I saw him, that we first came here. And it was this, that up to that point, like a great many people, I thought of abolition as a cause that was taken up by very nice white people, and that the slaves or the free blacks were all without any kind of agency. They said, you know, thank you, Massa Lincoln, for setting us free, but we didn't have anything to do with it. And in the light of the 1960s, and that's when, I think the book came out about 1970, 71, in the light of what had been going on in the 60s, it seemed, yeah, they probably did have some agency. And that was what he was convincing his reader of, that the role of the blacks as well as of the white abolitionists was crucial. And Lewis Tappan came down to Philadelphia to see what he could do to help these good people who were meeting in this church. And along with him came the editor of a colonization newspaper called William Lloyd Garrison. That's a slightly older picture of Garrison. And a third individual who became influential in funding education in the North for African-American children. And again, his name has slipped. But they were so convinced by the speakers at Mother Bethel, because very much like the argument that, and they were familiar with it, that had been made in immediate, not gradual abolition, that where you could talk about, we've made great strides by saying that your children will be free in another 20 odd years. The people who were talking about the need for the abolition of slavery were talking about their mother or their father, their sister, their brother, maybe even their children who were still held in slavery somewhere in the United States. And that had an immediatism, which is a word that Tappan and Garrison adopted. It has to be done now. So the abolition movement was born in the United States in 1831. They formed the American Anti-Slavery Society. Again, you'll notice that all the pictures, all the people in the photograph are or if it's, maybe it's a drawing, I can't tell, are all white reformers, well-intentioned, good people. And this, next to this is from 1840, the American Anti-Slavery Almanac, with pictures of the terrible treatment which they were documenting of slaves in the states where it was legal. Now, in Jamaica in 1831, slaves took considerable agency. They had a strike which turned into an open revolt, and they were savagely repressed by the British authorities. And that had a great deal in influencing the bill that was introduced to abolish slavery and provide an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies, for promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves, don't forget that phrase, and for compensating the persons hitherto entitled to the services of such slaves. It is enacted that from and after the first day of August, 1834, all persons who, in conformity with the laws now in force in the said colonies respectively, shall on or before the first day of August 1835 have been duly registered as slaves in any such colony, and on the same day will actually be in that colony, and who would then become free. All right, let's not leave this. I want to come back to this. So that is adopted as of the 19th of March, 1834, and on the 1st of August, the slaves would be free. That's the king's giving his that lower bit there. Now, what did this act involve? It involved promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves, namely that exactly like we were doing, the slaves in the British colonies would have to serve their former master for a period of years. This was an apprenticeship that was supposed to lead you to being independent, economically independent. It was, of course, no different from what you'd been doing previously. So if you were employed in cutting sugarcane or in shoeing horses, you know, you would continue to do that for the master for an extended time. But the key thing in this bill is that absolutely no provision was made for the slave who, finally becoming free, would also be penniless. You were not even like an indentured servant entitled to freedom dues of a certain amount of money or a suit of clothes or agricultural implements or something. You were entitled to zero. And nobody was going to provide that for you out of the official coffers. However, every owner of every slave was to be compensated with the full market value of the slaves that they had no longer that they no longer owned. And this amounted to an enormous sum of money taken from the British Treasury. And it was available as a bonus to people who perhaps had just, they lived in England and they had an investment in a sugar plantation in Barbados. And if the sum of money that was to be granted was 136,000 pounds for that particular plantation, maybe your share would be just 10%, but you would get a very nice sum of money that you could invest in something else. And this is precisely what happened. That's why Laura Trevelyan said that the Trevelyans, who incidentally were a family of British historians, George Macaulay Trevelyan and others in the line, these people were able to do this because they suddenly got a lump sum of money from plantations they owned in Grenada. The Gregg family, I'm just going to take one more example. The Gregg family, who had been in the flaxseed trade, they were merchants in Belfast. They had been in the flaxseed trade in the 18th century, and had expanded into Dominica when that became a British island. And the plantations there were left to one of the Greggs who lived in England at that point. And he invested in an enormous expansion of the cotton mills that the Greggs owned in Manchester. And much of the British industry, which had been funded in many ways by slave trade and slavery, long before 1834, after 1834, had a great deal of money injected into it, and it allowed tremendous expansion, and a great deal of the power of the British Empire came from this transfer of money from the Treasury to the individuals who had a stake in slavery. There's a picture there of Daniel O'Connell arguing he's standing in the old Houses of Parliament, which burned in 1836, and arguing very likely for the abolition of slave trade. He was the Irish liberator who had pushed through Catholic emancipation in 1829, and he then moved completely to becoming an abolitionist for the end of slavery everywhere. Now, he was extraordinarily popular obviously with people in his native Ireland, and also with those Irish people who had come to the United States. And in 1842, O'Connell sent a letter to the Irish in America telling them that they were obliged in every form of conscience to join the abolitionists and fight for the freedom of the African slaves. And the response from the Irish American community, which had been donating money regularly to O'Connell's cause for the end of the Union, the 1800 Union of Ireland in the United Kingdom, they turned their backs on him. He was a dreadful man. He didn't know what he was doing. And the great wave of new converts to abolitionism in the United States never happened. Now, we're back here. You see, they needed to serve another 4 years as apprentices. And here people are working on these little plots. They must be setting out. I don't know anything about raising sugar. They must be preparing for planting sugarcane. And on the left hand is a picture that represents the workhouse in one of the West Indian colonies at that time, and where people who did not do the work they were supposed to do were sent. And this was a treadmill that they are working on. So if you weren't working out as an apprentice in the fields, you could be sent to the workhouse, and there you would do collective work for the benefit of the planters. But the slave owners were compensated at a cost of $200 billion in 2023 equivalent dollars. So that was an enormous amount of money injected into the British economy from the Treasury. And you can see someone picking a pocket for 20 million. And what was the legacy of slavery and of this slow method of emancipation? Well, it's still with us in every form. And what can we do about it? So I perhaps went a few minutes too long, but let's get into your comments and your questions.
Thank you, Richard, very much. This was well done, and thanks to Julianne too for putting together the PowerPoint. Any questions or comments? Yes, I'll get you next. Sure.
With the legislation that's being passed in Tallahassee every moment of this session, ILR may be shut down as a result of this talk.
Yes, yes, that's
Just
very true.
don't breathe a word of it. I'm going to get this lady back there, then I'll come to you.
Richard, one of our residents, John Furches, provided the name, if you look at the screen, provided the name of the woman who was she a school teacher who was for abolishing slavery? Elizabeth?
Oh, Elizabeth Hayrick, yes. It's Elizabeth Hayrick. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I was born in Jamaica, and we always learned that the Rothschilds put up $20 million for the compensation of slaves. And I believe that it went to the Treasury because they were paying off the debt to the Rothschilds until 2005.
Very interesting.
Follow the money, as they say.
Richard, thank you very much for an enlightening talk. I think that one of the things that we have to be very well aware of is the economic value of slavery.
Yes.
The fact that at the time of the Civil War, slaves represented in this country the major capital asset is, I think, vital to understand why today we have the problems we now have. Because once you've got this kind of capital investment with, for instance, the reparations to the slave owners, I think they last ended in the very early years of this century.
Yes.
In Britain.
Yes.
These were bonds, treasury bonds, that went forward. This is a huge psychological problem for today's generations, which they're not aware of. And the result is it calls for reparation in England or in this country are met with fury. This anti-woke campaign we're now seeing is nothing less than a direct consequence of trying to tackle a problem that has not been properly perceived or properly structured. Long way towards achieving it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. A good point.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Very quickly, there are many forms of resistance by Africans and enslaved persons, and one form was birth control and abortion. These were practiced in Jamaica in the 18th century by enslaved women. It was herbal. It was common. The planters were furious. Why don't they have babies? And the population would not increase. Consequently, more and more people were brought in from Africa. Once the slave trade ended in the early 19th century, very, very, very gradually, in the first 20 years, the babies in Jamaica began to survive.
That's an interesting just response of the people. Yes.
I think we have Paul. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yes, my hand doesn't go up on the screen, but thank you very much, Richard. Your talk enlightened some things I've been looking at and we've discussed before. But I'd like to comment on the issue that you're raising about compensation and certainly the transfer of funds to Britain in compensation to be handed out to people who needed to be compensated and then invested elsewhere. One of the big investments, in fact, is I think a growing evidence that the cotton kingdom that developed here primarily in the 18th century was beginning in the 19th century, it grew in the 19th century and began in the 18th century, was funded by a lot of that money and was funded by people even in the 18th century who were getting rich on sugar were people who also owned plantations in the South and in the United States and in Rhode Island, where a lot of the sugar went to be made into rum. So there's been a connection between the West Indies and its development of the sugar kingdoms and the development of the rich cotton South. I think it's McLean at Duke who makes the statement that the Southern planters were the richest aristocracy in the world. That's comment one. Comment two, the French had freed slaves in 1792 during the Revolution. Robespierre wanted to free the slaves, not only, in Africa and other places, but around the world where France had colonies. So the Haitian Revolution has a direct connection to the freedom of slaves or the emancipation that occurred in 1790s in the French colonies. And the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution culminated in the terrible massacres that occurred at 1802 or 1803, when Napoleon wanted to stop the emancipation and reinstate slavery, and he sent 40,000 troops to Haiti, most of whom did not come home either through the warfare with Toussaint and the army, the Haitian army that was developed, or through disease. So the connections and the interconnections between West Indian slavery and cotton and slavery are very strong and very much rooted in European colonialism in the West Indies.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Paul. Well, folks, we're reaching our appointed time here. Thank you again, Richard, for a very enlightening hour. And I want to tell you that next week, the Wonders turn to a different subject entirely. We're going to be hearing from the executive director of the Gainesville Grow Hub, which is a nursery, nonprofit nursery here in Gainesville that is operated by adults with disabilities. It's a very fascinating story. I hope you'll join us next week for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being patient.
Thanks.